Good afternoon or good day, whatever you can call it. I'm glad to be here with a new speaker and more deep knowledge into the animation industry. So I hope we can have an amazing presentation as we did last time. This is Mara from Pixar Animation Studio. So I will let her introduce herself.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining. I'm Mara, as Stefan was saying. I'm a character modeler rigger at Pixar, and for this presentation on BoPeep, I also worked on in the art department doing some concept art for her as well. And I worked a little bit before coming to Pixar in mobile games and console gaming, as well as at DreamWorks before starting at Pixar about 4 years ago now. And I worked before that, before being at Pixar, mostly in rigging and as a pipeline TD. And at Pixar, the modeling and rigging departments are combined. And so been doing a lot more modeling and sort of like art related work there. And that's a little bit of intro on me.
Perfect. So we're going to start with the presentation, and afterwards we can answer more questions deeply. So keep see the presentation as much as you can because it's very deeply into the character design and also the rigging and animation. So stay tuned and good luck.
Hi, I'm Mara Macmahon, and I'll be talking about the design and creation of BoPeep, starting in story, through design, and various stages of production. To start, I wanted to point out the many artists across various disciplines that collaborated on bringing this character to the screen. This is Team Bo, all the men and women who brought BoPeep to life on Toy Story 4. This was an unusually collaborative show, partially because of the atypical production timeline as well. Artists across teams in the pipeline who are working on her would meet weekly to trade ideas, updates, and give each other feedback. So for example, Carrie, who's in story, would share updates on the story pitches and ideas that she was working on, as Radford and tailoring could weigh in on what it meant for a particular story beat, to have Bo untying her cape and slinging it over her shoulder, maybe have suggestions for how Carrie could approach it. This was a lot of fun because these departments don't typically interact face to face, much less get to actually kind of give feedback and guide and sort of riff off of each other's work. So why did Toy Story 4 have a somewhat unusual timeline for us? It was originally slated to come out when Cars 3 did, which is 2017, and it was delayed to rework the story. And you guys know that it came out last year in 2019. So what this meant is a lot of assets were taken partially to completion, and when production resumed, were picked up where they left off over a year ago, or redesigned to match the new story. So what happened to Bo? Her initial revival and redesign happened in the first stage, through modeling and early rigging, and then I joined in the second half along with a handful of other artists on the art team to help with designing the modern Bo outfit that's modified from her classic dress, and to pick up where the rigging had left off from my colleague Tanya Crampert. So these images represent a before and after, reimagining Bo through every element. Because she was a minor character in early Toy Story, her personality was simpler and needed more depth and fleshing out. And in the 20 years since we've last seen her, more powerful and complex tools are part of her workflow now. And we can use these to update and to match her look to be consistent with the other characters in the current Toy Story universe. I wanted to take a second to talk about photorealism in Toy Story as well. I personally don't think it's automatic that we want everything to look perfectly realistic in animated films. It's a stylistic choice, just like any other, and it was deliberate for the Toy Story series in particular to support the story goals, which is to bring toys to life. The goals were to make the audience believe that their own toys have a life in a world of their own after we leave the room. And part of that was showing that these characters could have been plucked from our own world. So to start with, I wanted to highlight some of the words from Valerie Lapointe, head of story, and Carrie Hobson, a story artist. They both focused a lot on Bo throughout production, although some of the artwork I'm going to show includes the work of many more story artists. So rather than a brand new BoPeep, we were thinking of her as the Bo that you never fully knew because this character we only saw kind of briefly, and she's evolved from a baby's lamp to a lost toy. As we explored Bo's story, we explored a character arc that largely happened behind the scenes. The audience wasn't there for it. So we were coming up with ideas and moments to build off what has been established, which is, what did we see of Bo and Woody's relationship back in Toy Story 1 and 2? We know that they had a flirtatious dynamic with Bo as a voice of reason to Woody when he'd freak out. She was much more kind of calm and level-headed to his very high energy, nervous personality. Then we started imagining what life was like during the in-between moments as toys in a kid's room and Bo's unique situation as part of a lamp. We thought of all the potential obstacles she could have endured and dramatic possibilities that could have shaped her character over the years. She's made out of porcelain. That's certainly something we couldn't ignore. And she's part of a lamp, so she wasn't initially meant to be a toy, although she could long for that. What does it mean to be part of a lamp when she's kind of out in the world? The antique store was part of our human world, so how would that experience shape her character? Is it a cutthroat toy city where she's Robin Hood? Did she dream of the safe life as a figurine behind glass? Did she embrace her porcelain side, being a collectible doll? Or did she decide to ditch her lamp and the constraints it brought? And in earlier versions of the production, these were all ideas we explored quite far. Ultimately, what her character evolution became really depended on two things. First one is the big story reason, which is what realization do we want her and Woody to have by the end of the film because of the time they spent together? What change do they sort of impart on each other? The second is, what's the most fun, exciting, unexpected thing? What would we love to see Bo become? We've seen Woody go through a lot of adventures through the Toy Story films, and we wanted to explore new ideas with this one. And, as an example, one of the earlier ideas that, I talked about was that she might want to be a collector's doll on the shelf. And that honestly is pretty similar to Toy Story 2. It's one of the reasons why we moved past that and started exploring other avenues for our character. So ultimately, where did we land? She's part of a baby lamp, which means she moves on sooner than other toys. Kids get tired of her at a much younger age, and so she's constantly being given away or put up for donation. She experienced loss more frequently and is fragile because she's made out of porcelain, so she risks more than other toys during playtime. This doesn't mean that she couldn't want to just be a toy to be played with, and she longed to experience adventure that's at odds with what she's made of. So she ultimately discovered the joy of being a lost toy without a kid. So we've established in the first Toy Story film that being a lost toy is pretty much the ultimate toy nightmare. What kind of toy chooses this? What does it mean for Woody to reunite with a familiar face that now has such a different perspective on being a toy? And we get to explore that through Bo. This is where the details of modern Bo begin to emerge. She's more adaptable, fun-loving, living in the moment. And now that we have kind of these tentpole ideas in story, we can move on to think about how to support it in the design process. But before we get ahead of ourselves on modern Bo, we did have to revive classic Bo. Digging into the archives, we had to recreate her from the last time she appeared on screen in 1999. Daniela Strizleva in art and Tanya Cranford in characters were both instrumental in bringing classic Bo to life before Al and I and other artists got to work on modern Bo's design. So they looked at original artwork for BoPeep, exploring her character in Toy Story 1 and 2. And these are some drawings from the first film. And although she doesn't look like this in the final result, this was all worth studying to understand the initial intent for her character. What had they tried? Why? What didn't they end up going with, and why didn't they do that? Pixar keeps pretty thorough archives on our old films, so things like original sketches, paintings, clay sculptures are preserved. And so Tanya had the great opportunity to check out Beau's original maquette from the archives. And you can see here in the original process, she was sculpted in clay, which we still do, but this was essentially the only workflow back then. The wireframe was drawn on the sculpture. You can see it there on her hands and her face. And it was traced by Galen, who's in the photo on the right, to create the digital sculpture. So Tanya was also able to find the old model, which we couldn't use, but studied for reference. And you can see, it was originally NURBS, and the body was broken up beneath the garment. In the middle, you can see that the feet basically only go up to the ankles, the arms stop at the shoulders, etc. Eyes were planes in the face. So while the character was really successful for the time, it was a golden opportunity to recreate BoPeep in a contemporary pipeline and workflow. Tanya also took a reference trip down to LA to see how the Disney's collector dolls were made. And it was fascinating to see the prototypes and how they were designed. For Tanya, it was important to see what kind of dolls little girls seemed attracted to and studied the various face molds and really found it interesting to see somebody actually hand painting the dolls' faces. These were some ideas that we incorporated later into shading, lashes, brows, etc. She also found some great references at flea markets and antique shops. And you can see there are really compelling details in the paint. For example, strokes for the eyebrows or cracks in the glaze that we recreated in her skin and hair. You can also see, looking at porcelain figures, there's a very soft melted look to the surface because of how the glaze is applied and the firing process. So from this, she knew that sharp edges and fine details in the form weren't really something that we would see on Beau. These would have been washed out in the process of creating these porcelain sculptures. So with the research side of it complete, we got approval from the director to start over with our own design. And Daniela created numerous sketches to explore not just Beau's outfit, but how her face and body would be shaped. You can see up there on the right, there are also a bunch of different outfits that she had explored for kind of other story directions that had happened earlier. These drawings, which are kind of starting to build out the idea of classic Beau, helped Tanya to get started on a digital sculpt in her lamp pose, as we called it, on the far left, which is basically what she looks like when she's standing still on her lamp. So next, we look at modern Beau's design process, which all started with a sketch from Josh Cooley, our director. He had something and he shared it with us, and he goes, "Here you go, let's come up with some ideas for Beau." And he challenged us to flesh out this character, basically who she became after years and years on the road as a lost toy. And the fun thing about the sketch is it's a kitchen sink of ideas. It's a whole bunch of different things that she could have run into that kind of suggest things about her character. And he basically was like, use this as a jumping off point, use it as inspiration, just go and try stuff. So the entire art team dove in on the process, and every morning the art room would be filled floor to ceiling with sketches and photos and ideas that each artist had come up with the day before. And then the director, Josh, would come in and we'd figure out what worked and what didn't based on what he was working on in story at the time. So I kind of want to share some of those different types of designs that we kind of move past, but all with very deliberate reason. One of the things that we started with is we tried a common character type, which is kind of the adventure heroine. You see her a lot in action movies and video games. And this kind of character is a tomboy. She's one of the guys, kind of the quintessential strong female character. And we realized in the case of the character that we were trying to create, we didn't want to equate strength with masculinity. And we felt that parts of Beau's personality from the original, about her very feminine and kind of elegant design, we wanted to kind of persist through to modern Beau. The other thing that we didn't really want is the sense of gritty survival. This, even as a lost toy, she does this for fun. It's a lighthearted lifestyle. And so the more kind of hard and intense we make it feel, I think the less true to the story that we wanted to tell. So there are more ideas along this theme here, but they're a little more playful in tone. You can see the artist is exploring how she adapted her environment, kind of like a little borrower, taking pieces of other toys, little props, cutting and modifying her skirt, which is actually one of the aspects that we did end up going with. So one of the things we were starting to think about is, as a toy, she doesn't have the same resource needs that a living being has. She doesn't need food, shelter, or water. So even when she's out and about, kind of surviving in the open as a lost toy without a kid, she's still comfortable. She adapts by using tape to repair when she breaks, but we didn't want to do too much kind of modification. And again, the idea is this is fun and she enjoys it. There's also some really interesting friction from Woody's assumption that she isn't happy as a lost toy, and that she obviously must want a kid, but it turns out she actually loves the freedom and mobility of the lifestyle that she has. Here are some more kind of feminine designs that felt a little more like the original Bo, with stickers, hair elastics, and flowers. And we ended up gravitating towards a simpler look because it had been 20 years since the audience has seen Bo. So we wanted her to be instantly recognizable when she's on screen. What are her familiar colors and patterns? What was her silhouette? How do we reduce and simplify elements back to that bell shape from her dress and the few colors she started with, the pink and white dots, the light blue solid color? We found the simplicity worked really well using Bo's layer beneath her dress, which you can sort of see hints of in the original, which is the blue pants and the upper layer that's kind of light blue. And the fact that their pants fit her new lifestyle much better. It was easier for her to get around, but she can keep the dress and reuse it in different ways. So Carrie here took Daniela's original sketch of classic Bo and kind of tried modifying it, taking the dress off to use it as a cape, to use it as a bag, or just discard it altogether. And this ended up being the direction we moved in. It felt like it really underscored her adaptability as a toy. It was still simple. It was still recognizable because you still have that familiar silhouette when she wears it as a cape. And there are different play modes. When she's wearing it as a cape, kids can play with her as an action figure. When she's wearing it as a dress, she can be a doll. And it kind of breaks out of the idea that you have to be one type of toy. And it worked for her life on the road. So once we landed on this design, we started to flesh out how the dress would be used, how it would move as if it was being worn by a toy at a small scale. So we'll see a little more of this in the cloth and the shading section, but it was a really cool, challenging asset to make. So now that we have the design in place, modeling and rigging. Tanya worked on Bo's modeling and rigging, and I continued where she left off when we started on modern Bo later on. Going back to reference again and archives. So the original model, like I'd mentioned, didn't have a body. And so first thing we had to do is kind of build out her entire kind of form. Going back to Daniela's drawings, rather than actually a detailed packet with kind of like front and side and really precise concept art, Tanya worked off of sketches like these to flesh out Bo's design in 3D and in close collaboration with Daniela. Tanya usually likes to start with modeling the eyes and mouth. These facial features are the most important for her. And in this abbreviated video of her process, you can see the features like the eyelash need to be melted into her face, soft nostrils, like barely, just kind of very soft indents, kind of the hairline, you don't see it here, is actually connected. It's all a single continuous piece. And this is actually the high-res model. This is the render model. It's a lower than average resolution because we're really aiming for a smooth as possible surface. We wanted to minimize complexity and deformations and stuff that came with like pinching and stuff like that. And it was certainly challenging and more like complex posing, but in the end, it was much more practical for the look that we were trying to achieve. You can see drawers to kind of refine the shape of her solid lashes. Again, they're melted on. They're just carved in as part of her face. There were always questions of how close or far to land from the original design, because ultimately it had to be recognizable as Bo, but there was plenty of room to adapt the design, especially to support more complex emotions and deformations that we weren't able to achieve at the time of like Toy Story 1 and 2. A lot of drawers to refine subtle form. The anatomy is there, but it's very soft. Again, looking at lots of reference. And with the model approval, she could dive into rigging, although it's rarely so clear-cut. It's often back and forth as rigging process highlights changes needed in the model. And actually in our department, the modeler and rigger are the same person working on the character, which is fantastic because you can really work on the topology and the modeling with your own future rigging work in mind. Really cool stuff. I I like seeing the timestamp here from 2015 because the movie came out in 2019. So this was the first half of production before it was paused. And it's kind of nuts for me to think about how long ago this film stretches back. More examples, how her cheeks change when she's smiling. You can see notes in there about avoiding a full crease because, again, everything should be super soft and smooth. And, a lot of time was spent working on her mouth and eye shapes to make her really appealing. Here are some expression drawings and an animation test. In particular, her brows were quite tricky. The idea was that in any expression, they should look fluid enough to be painted by like a single brush stroke. Lots of iteration and refinement to make sure all the control combinations actually looked smooth. No hard edges or complex shapes. That's in contrast with, I don't know, take something like Incredibles, which has a lot of angular sculptural design elements. Mr. Incredible's eyebrows are very graphic and can look geometric. Those are kind of the opposite side of the spectrum. They look very different for specific reasons about her material and what she is. How does an elbow or wrist look like when she's moving? More thoughts on just building out the body rig and the deformations there. So now we get to cloth, how we created Bo's classic and modern outfits. So starting again with reference, there was focus on researching Victorian era style of dress for that distinctive bell-shaped silhouette. And you can see examples of her dress in TS1 and 2. It was intended to read as fabric, but with the tools they had at the time, they actually just used a shaded mesh to approximate the look, used some deformers to make it swish and move when she walked, rather than simulating digital cloth. So we also more or less started from scratch on her dress as well. See here in practical human tailoring, we have solutions for bell silhouettes, how to build out that shape and structure. Taking a quick aside, we're trying to remember though that Bo exists at toy scale. She's being played with by a child. And the reason that we were trying to emphasize that almost more so than the other toys is because BoPeep has the most natural proportion of the toys. Unlike Woody, Buzz, or Jessie, she's a porcelain sculpture of a human. So, Woody has like a really long head and Buzz has a really large torso. They're obviously like very kind of stylized, cartoony proportions, and hers are much more naturalistic. So we needed to really lean into reminders that she is small and she's toy-like and not a human or not a tiny human. So more on shading later, but the texture and the behavior of the cloth really needs to reinforce this scale. Another consideration, a handful of things that they were keeping in mind is that we needed other characters to be able to approach her closely without bumping into a cage skirt. So you would want that volume, but you would also want it to be able to deform when needed. And her silhouette had that iconic volume and need to move in a way, again, that made sense at this scale. So you can see those different layers to make up that shape. The crinoline and bustle on the far right, they just existed for sim and wouldn't render. So here, this is Bo's original look reimagined for Toy Story 4 in the scenes when we flash back to her time together with Woody. And you can see again, like, noticing how stiff the dress is. It's being worn by someone that's like maybe 10 inches tall and not, 5 or 6 feet tall. And also the big bell shape there that was created by all those layers that you saw earlier. So the next time they reunite, it's nearly 20 years later. So let's jump into how we approached her modern look. So we were essentially taking all of these pieces that focus on the Victorian silhouette, that bell, which contributed to a very limited movement too. The bonnet, the puffy sleeves, the petticoats, and we take them away. This is again simplifying down to just the iconic dress and that underlayer. There was a year or more of design to get to this point, although it looks very simple, just flipping back and forth. So it's just a skirt on, a one piece basically. What's the big deal? So it's like those YouTube videos where it's like turn your scarf into 100 different things. It's not maybe 100, but the wraparound skirt is a piece of cloth that became whatever Bo would want it to be. And so there were a handful of different setups for how she would wear the skirt, interact with it. The example there doesn't include also the various ways that she would wear it around her waist. But you can see there was a handful for just the cape alone, how it would drape around your shoulders, would it fall in front, behind. The tailoring team basically wanted to be ready for versatility. They wanted to be flexible. So in a single model, our tailor, Radford Hearn, set up splines and constraints to help us guide the movement pre-simulation while hoping to respect the flow of motion of an actual skirt. I worked on some cloak studies to help guide the motion and acting, thinking about how she might hit these new silhouettes and transition her skirt to a cloak, while still ensuring stiff, simple motion that felt right for somebody less than a foot tall. Also thinking about how she would use it as a tool to navigate the real world. I fleshed out these sketches to use as reference for animation, how her acting choices would be guided by what she was wearing, how she would use it when she was gesturing or moving. Mariana also created 2 life-size versions of this dress, which could be worn as a cape, flipped inside out, for animators and sim artists to use as reference. It was incredibly useful. And here's the final lineup: classic bow, modern bow, and the versatility that this new design provided. And it's probably a simple handful of all the different variants that ended up being used for the film. So now we get into shading. Again, going back to reference, you can see, getting to the mode, thinking about texture, there's some specularity on the skin to suggest porcelain, but it's a simpler, more graphic look based on the tools at the time. So let's dig a little more into the nuances of what porcelain actually looks like, knowing with our toolset and pipeline today that we can get a lot more detail out of it. We noticed irregularities in the brushwork. You can see pooling, little like speckles here and there. It's all imperfections of the hand-painted glazing process. These are more excerpts from the shading packet. What I was talking about with pooling, you can sort of see here how the paint gathers and darkens in the cracks, and the color isn't perfectly even across the surface. And things that seem like kind of small, almost imperceptible details, because we're looking at these toys so close, they're, close-ups on screen, something that's a detail that's like maybe the size of your small pinky nail is going to be really obvious when you're looking at them as like characters face to face. This is a shading paint over by Laura Murphy. The thing that she was trying to highlight and explore is this thing called crazing, which happens when the porcelain body and then the clear glaze on top, they expand and contract at different rates. And what you get are those little like kind of cracks that you can see, those translucent cracks that are on the surface. And it doesn't break the silhouette, but you can see it kind of shows up and it goes away at different angles in the light. And it's a really great way to subtly layer on age and wear for this kind of material. So we played around with crazing, cracks, chips on bow, and kind of asked, okay, how far should we go? Where do we do it? She's been out and about, so you don't want it to look like she's kind of perfect and hasn't saw hurt at all, but at the same time, you don't want it to be distracting. You want it to support her performance. We ended up avoiding too much of these attributes on her face, and we kept it kind of a little more subtle elsewhere because we didn't want it to become distracting. And especially on her face, it would be a little more obvious when it's stretched or distorted with expressions. You can imagine like all those little like crazing fracture lines. If it was like around her brows or around her mouth, it would be really obvious when it was distorting. So just cycling through a couple more examples from her shading packet. These things are translated with attention to scale, maybe things that she found on the playground that added to her outfit. And now we kind of have that body of knowledge. Applying it to the asset, we're going to take the shading work done by George Nguyen and break down the components of BoPeep's porcelain surface shading. And we're going to start with this frame from the film. Get rid of everything, just focusing on Bo. Here, he's neutralized the lighting and removed other objects in the scene. You can see there's base ceramic albedo. There's underglaze painted on hair, brows, eyeliner, lips, eyes. This is a traditional diffuse shading model that they've shaded basic Toy Story plastic materials with in the past. Next, we'll look at the basic ceramic material. It's a lot more translucent and scattery. It really softens hard edges and shows light bleed through thinner areas. So this is like exaggerated really to show the effect. The subsurface scatter is also added here. It physically, quotation marks, traces light paths through the interior of the surface, preserving the details of the geometry much better than our earlier models. So you can see now back and forth. then adjusting the scatter distance to better preserve detail on her face so the animation reads better, the shape of her lips, her lashes, all of that. And continuing, we can apply the exit paint of the facial features. And you can see they actually act as a shadow to block some of the subsurface scatter. And then much of the complex and layered look of porcelain comes from the glaze, which is shown as a simple clear coat here. Going back and forth, there's a bit of difference here. So one of the key visual qualities of a shiny exterior is that it's 100% reflective when viewed at glancing angles. This is called specular Fresnel, and it's most noticeable on smooth surfaces. We developed code to ensure that the glancing angles on the shiny layers would darken the lower layers to balance the total energy between light hitting and leaving the surface. Bo was the first visually compelling need to have this feature, but we've actually used it comprehensively on Cars 3 and every film we've done since. So in isolating out this, also Neon Toy Story 4, we've converted painted scratches and surface imperfections into bump roughness. So isolating this layer, we really exaggerated to show how they affect the highlight in the clear coat glaze. Now jumping back now, we made the glaze more saturated where it was thicker or pooling, remembering what you saw in the reference earlier on some of those figures, how it was getting more saturated and dark in kind of cracks and areas where the paint had collected. So here it's like in borders along her hair and nose, really exaggerated again, just for effect. We also wanted artistic control with painting exactly where we want to see the glaze tint effect, making it more subtle in the face, but dialing it up around the ears, for example. So here you can see all that stuff just taken back a notch.
No, bags are not mountain passes.
Oh my God. With subtle hints of the pooling from the last slide, which help add shaping by saturating the color in specific places. Now adding the crazing effect. You can see this on the left is reference with directional lighting, and you can see the side-by-side comparison between a real cup with crazing and BoPeep, both with the lines kind of fading in and out across the surface as the light direction changes. We want the effect subtle enough to be felt, but not so obvious that you can see it stretching when she moves. So again, we dialed it down to be very subtle. And artistically, we didn't want to obscure Bo's face, so we would paint out those areas for the most part. It's actually subtle enough that it might be hard to tell on these slides in smaller images. And then here you have it, the final result when she's in context in a scene and lit and everything. And the interesting and really kind of cool thing is that depending on the lighting situation, on the environment, how close or far, different aspects of that shading are revealed more strongly. And so it adds a lot of depth and kind of complexity, but it happens at in a subtle way that's not distracting from the performance. It kind of contributes to the sense of like, okay, this character is made of this material. It's a toy and it's small, without kind of screaming it out in your face. And then lastly, we're getting into animation. I want to explore how the animation team thought about BoPeep. She's one character, but she's portrayed at two different places in her life. Classic Bo in the prologue flashback scene, and then you have modern Bo in the rest of the movie. So they started by thinking about the similarities and differences between her classic and her modern self. Some of the biggest differences is, what we remember of classic Bo was she enjoyed the safety of a child's room. She's a constraining outfit with that dress and corset, so she can't actually move around super well. She might use her staff to help her with things, but she's very limited, and she's a little more reserved. Modern Bo, on the other hand, is a lot more independent and comfortable being on the road. No four walls of a kid's room, no kid even, just whoever happens to be out on the playground. She's much more athletic and mobile. Again, with the dress coming off and kind of utilizing the layer underneath, you can actually have her running around and tumbling and not kind of worrying about constrained motion. And she's become a lot more confident and outgoing in the time that she's spent as a lost toy. The things that are consistent between the two is that she's been a leader this whole time. We might not have seen as much of it in the original films, but you remember in early Toy Story 4, if you've seen it, that she, in a highlight segment in Molly's room, you realize that she's actually kind of the linchpin of all of the other toys that are Molly's room, where kind of the same role that Woody plays in Andy's room. You just kind of get a little glance of that. She's witty, she has a sense of humor, she's very practical and level-headed. And so the idea of balancing the things that are different with the things that are similar is that she needs to come across as the same character, but she's been through a lot of change. How can you make her still recognizable at the core? You know, if you've ever run into a friend that you haven't seen since you were a kid, maybe they've changed a lot, but there would still be incredibly familiar parts of their personality. On top of all of this, you know, the Anim team is really starting to think about, but how would her body language be different? How does she carry herself? How is she able to move versus more constrained? There's really interesting things for them to think about in posing. The next thing the animation team thought about, which we've touched on in almost every topic coming up to this, is just like with cloth and shading, scale. They're constantly trying to remind the audience that we're animating a toy, not a human, even though her proportions are closer to humans. She's 10 inches tall. So here's an interesting animation test. Early in production, when they were animating Bo, they quickly found that she easily just felt too human. So in this test, they took the original animation, which is located in the center of a screen, which was like, okay, middle animation, just animate it as you would normally any typical human character. And then they did variations on the left and right to try to toyify her movements a little more. And what did that mean? Typically in animation, we want to exaggerate movements, but for Bo, they actually needed to decrease and really dial it back to make her look like a toy. So there's less overlap, less weight. She's stiffer. Movements might be a little bit faster. And revisiting this animation test from earlier, another trick we used was to choose which part of her body were solid, which parts could be more pliable. So, for example, we never wanted to see her hair or her hairline move, which is tricky because there's not much room between her brows and her hairline. Sometimes we would cheat it very subtly if her brows had to go up or she had a really big expression. But why not? Her face is moving, her body's moving. True, but we wanted to balance how much of her can remain stiff while she acts to give the impression of porcelain. Too much movement and she might look like flexible plastic or a bit too gummy. So it's a balance that they were exploring a lot in the early stages of animation. And I also want to look at some of the reference that they pulled up as they were exploring Bo. Large and varied pool, but here are a couple examples. They looked at gymnasts like Ali Reichman. She's got really efficient and skilled movement. There's protection of her body and limbs by how straight her arms are, her legs are together. It helps with her balance and motion, but also a sense of protection from injury. And this results in really powerful, fluid movements that are both controlled and calculated. These were the same aspects that we really tried to keep in mind working on Bo. How she needs to move carefully to avoid damaging herself as a porcelain doll. But years on the road, she's gotten really good at this. So she's very confident in her motions and very kind of controlled and precise. Here are some other fun examples, ranging from martial arts to dance, and lots more videos besides. Something that we're constantly kind of reminding each other is these aren't literal targets. You know, you don't literally see a motion from here copied into a shot or something. As inspiration, they're part of a large variety of videos and images and conversations. One of our directing animators called it basically like a spice drawer. When you have an animator working on different shots, different situations, it calls for different kinds of reference, and having as much variety as possible is really helpful. The animators can adapt and combine different motions and come up with their own ideas using these as a jumping off point. So looking at all of that together, just wanted to share a snippet of Bo in action, drawing on the various ideas we described earlier about her motion. And it's been this combination of incredibly skilled, hardworking, and collaborative artists that have evolved Bo into the character that she is today. And it's the same thing that I love about working in this industry: the storytelling, the craft, and above all, the people that are a part of it.
Hi, it's good to be back. It's been a great presentation. Just to let you know, it was pre-recorded because there is a lot of like a technicalities into the presentation. Also, as well with the internet overload, because the last time we saw with Joe that we had some problems with the internet when we were live. So definitely now you can ask your questions as well. I have some questions. So please let us know in the comments. Okay, so I wanted to ask you, Mara, when you're working on such a large projects, how do you, let's say, communicate? That's the biggest problem when there is a lot, is the large campus. So definitely there is a lot of difficulties when you're receiving a feedback. So how do you coordinate?
Well, as much as possible, trying to meet up face to face. I think in the case with Bo, and a lot of similar characters that were being remade on Toy Story 4, it was almost more production that was put on hold. And then you're starting up again and you're trying to figure out, okay, where did we leave off? What still needs to be done? What's changing? And so we actually met every week. We had like that team Bo. Anybody that was working on BoPeep at the time, we would grab tea every week and kind of talk about what we were working on. And it ended up being a really effective way to sort of make sure, because, shading and animation and rigging and often like story changes and maybe like outfit changes were happening all at the same time, that ended up being the most efficient way to figure out how to make those changes without kind of messing up other people's work.
Is there any involvement from your creativity, or any suggestion, or you're just following, let's say, what's are the feedback? Because definitely artists have a large involvement into the project. So I wanted to ask you if when somebody, let's say your supervisor is giving you, let's say, a feedback. So do you have any, let's say, correction also for him, or any thoughts that can make even the project better?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it definitely depends on the project and kind of where in the stage the character is at. I think I always feel that for the most part, people are really receptive to feedback. And as long as, let's say, when you have an idea or you're getting a note, then you have an alternative suggestion, to always try to phrase it or think about it in terms of, what are you trying to communicate with this character? What kind of character arc do you want BoPeep to have? Well, I have this suggestion. Do you think this would support the character better than what you're saying? Or you can, I think oftentimes what you can sort of do that's a little more diplomatic maybe is, if I'm getting some feedback to make a certain modeling change, for example, on her character, I can maybe bring back that modeling change and hit it for review, but also mock up my own idea and say, hey, I have what you asked for, but I also tried this thing. What do you think? Because a lot of the times we have people bring up ideas, but it's really hard to know by imagining it how effective those notes might be. And so it does take a bit of extra work, but sometimes you can try to, as long as you're hitting the notes that you're being given, also try to provide some alternatives and just make sure to frame it in terms of what makes sense for the character and your goals for the story.
Yes, it's a a lot of questions. So you can start with the first one. We have also marked them.
Great. Okay. So the first one is, I noticed that you as a team make a great deal of sketches. Is drawing necessary to be a successful modeler, rigger, animator? Honestly, I think it's just how I like to think. I've done a lot of drawing, and it's sort of how, for example, if I'm modeling, I might do drawovers on my own models. Or when I'm trying to think about an idea, I'll sketch it out in different ways, but I don't think it's a prerequisite. When people are looking at reels, oftentimes some figure drawing or some sense of understanding of anatomy, it could be sketches or it could be, are a really good way to show that you have an underlying sense of what realistic anatomy is. Because then if you know what realistic anatomy, how that works, then you can apply it to stylize on a cartoon character. And the next question is, does the character design team also use ZBrush? And then do Retopo in Maya, or is it done directly in Maya only? And so just to generally answer the question about our sculpting workflow, yes, we do use ZBrush. Honestly, it depends on the show, but I think there's some flexibility in what the individual modelers prefer. Some characters are sculpted in clay by our clay sculptors. and then they will be scanned in and then retopologized either in ZBrush or Maya. Typically what we do is when we have ZBrush sculpts, which is more common earlier in production, just because we can work more quickly. Then last of all, let me see. Question is, how much time does it take to design a character like BoPeep? And what is it like to work at Pixar? I think BoPeep's a little bit unusual because of the length of the production time. She was probably like altogether like a year, maybe over a year. And we certainly don't have that amount of time anymore. I would say for a main character, you would get probably like a good couple months of design, especially because they might start sketching and designing the character very, very early in the story process as a director is coming up with their pitches. And then as you get through modeling and rigging to prepare it for animation, sometimes you get design changes because once you bring it, you often find that maybe some of the things that were drawn on paper don't quite work when you're turning around the character. And then again, when you get into animation and you realize, oh, well, it's actually really hard to move or pose the character this way. Do we stick with the design or do we actually adapt it? And what it's like to work at Pixar, it's really exciting. I think even though we're all working from home right now, I look forward to being able to sign on and see my colleagues and kind of work with them. I think that's my favorite part about this industry is wherever I've worked, it's always been like a privilege and a lot of fun to work with other artists that are as excited as we are about this stuff.